In this course, I'm going to be teaching you everything you need to know to get started writing programs in Ruby. Now, Ruby is an extremely popular programming language, and it's also the programming language behind one of the most popular web development frameworks called Ruby on Rails. So if you're somebody who's looking to get into Ruby on Rails, or you just want to learn more about Ruby, you've come to the right place. In this course, I'm going to be showing you everything you need to know to get started. So we're going to start off with the basics, like installing Ruby, getting Ruby set up with a text editor, and executing your first Ruby program. And we're going to look at, some of the bare basics, things like variables. We're going to look at dealing with different types of data, storing data. We're going to learn things like if statements and loops. And then we're going to get into more advanced stuff. So we're going to talk about the ins and outs of object-oriented programming. We're going to talk about things like classes and objects. And all throughout this course, we're going to be using real-world examples. So I'm going to be showing you guys different, mini applications that you can build. We're going to build a couple different games. We'll build like a calculator. We can do all sorts of stuff. So not only are we going to be learning Ruby, but I'm going to be showing you guys how to apply it in a bunch of different situations. So I'm excited for you guys to come along in this course. I'm covering just about every major topic in Ruby. So by the end of the course, you should have a pretty solid understanding of what this language is about, what it can do, and what you can do with it. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to install Ruby on Windows. It's actually a pretty easy process. Essentially, all we have to do is use a Ruby installer that we can download from like Ruby's official website, and it'll basically walk us through all the installation instructions. So I'm over here on this website. It's rubyinstaller.org/downloads. And this has basically a Windows downloader that we can use. So you'll see down here, there's a bunch of different options. I'm going to be installing the latest version at the current time, which is Ruby 2.4. Just a quick disclaimer, the instructions in this video aren't going to work for Ruby versions below 2.4. So below 2.4, there's actually a different way that you can install it. But after 2.4 and above, then you can follow these instructions. So I'm just going to click this, and it should start downloading. When the download has finished, now all we have to do is run that program. So I'm going to go over to my downloads folder, and you'll see we have this Ruby installer. Let's double click that, and it should open up a window that we can work with. All right, so I'm just going to click through all of the options on this window. I'll accept the license, and now Ruby should start installing on our computer. All right, when the installer finishes running, all we have to do now is install one more thing. So you'll see over here there's a checkbox. It says Run RIDK Install. You want to make sure this is checked, and I'm just going to click Finish. So this should actually open up another window here. It says Ruby Installer 2. And you'll see over here that there's three options. So the first one says MSYS2 base installation. The second one says System Update, and then here it says MSYS2 MINGW Development Toolchain. Just for the purposes of being thorough, we're going to go ahead and install MSYS2 and the MINGW Development Toolchain. And I found doing this, it's best to just enter all of these options in order. Sometimes when you enter just 3, then you get an error because certain things aren't updated. So I'm going to go ahead and enter in 1, and then after that's done, 2, and then 3. And if we do that, then everything should be able to be downloaded correctly. So I'm just going to click 1, and we'll go ahead and run this. When that's done running, then we can just click 2, and we'll run that. And this is going to go ahead and update everything that we just installed. And finally, I just want to click this third option, so I'm going to type in 3, and we'll run that. All right, once you've run all 3 of those installers, then we're officially done with installing Ruby on our computer. The last thing I want to do is just check to make sure that everything got installed correctly. So I'm going to go down here, and inside of my search bar, I'm just going to type in CMD. So I'm just going to type CMD, and this option for the command prompt should come up. So you just want to click that. The command prompt is basically just a way that we can interact with the computer by giving it text commands. And we can go inside here to check to see what version of Ruby we have installed. So essentially what I want to do is just type in Ruby-V. And when I click enter, this should tell me the version of Ruby that I currently have on my computer. So as long as you're getting a version with the Ruby-V command, then you have Ruby installed on your computer, and you're ready to start writing some awesome programs. In this tutorial, I'm going to talk to you about installing Ruby on OS X. Now, one of the great things about OS X is it actually comes pre-installed with Ruby. So basically you don't actually need to install it. You should just already have it. But I just wanted to talk about in this video like how we can check to make sure that we have Ruby, and then I'll also talk a little bit about updating the version of Ruby that you have on your computer. So first thing I want to do is come up here to the search bar, and I'm just going to type in terminal. And basically this will open up the terminal. And the terminal is essentially just a program that allows us to interact with the computer, but using text commands. So inside the terminal, I just want to check to make sure that everything is installed with Ruby. So I'm just going to type out Ruby-V, and this should spit out a version number of Ruby. In my case, I have Ruby version 2.4.2. So as long as you're getting a Ruby version number that's getting printed out onto the screen, then you're good to go. And for the most part, if you're running OS X, you should have some version of Ruby installed on your computer. If you'd like to update this version though, for example, if you have maybe an outdated version of Ruby, I would recommend using a program called the Ruby Version Manager. And I'm not going to get too into using the Ruby Version Manager here, but I just wanted to bring it up so that if you are running an outdated version of Ruby, then you'll know kind of what to look for in order to update it. So something called the Ruby Version Manager, and it's basically a program that you can use to update the current version of Ruby that you have on your computer. So if you're trying to update your current version of Ruby, then use the Ruby Version Manager. But otherwise, you can basically just use whatever Ruby version that you have installed on OS X in order to follow along with this course. In this tutorial, I'm going to talk to you guys about getting a text editor for Ruby, and then we're also going to look at how we can write our first Ruby program and run our Ruby programs from the text editor that we download. Now, one of the cool things about Ruby is you can basically write Ruby code in any text editor you want. So you could use something simple like Notepad or TextEdit, or you could use like a dedicated environment that was built just for writing Ruby. In our purposes for this course, I'm going to be using a special text editor called Atom. And this is basically a text editor, but it's been designed to support Ruby, and so it's going to be an awesome environment where we can write our Ruby code. So I'm going to show you guys how to install Atom. We're going to talk about setting it up and getting it ready to go. But just a quick disclaimer, like you don't have to use Atom if you don't want. That's what I'm going to be using for this course, but like I said, you can basically use any text editor that you want to write your Ruby programs. So let's go ahead and install Atom. I'm going to come down here to my web browser, and up here in the URL bar, I just want to type in atom.io. And this is the official website for the Atom text editor. What this should do is it should bring you to a page for your operating system. So in my case, I'm on a Mac, so it gives me this download for Mac option. If you're on a Windows machine, then it'll give you a download for Windows option. I'm just going to click this and we'll go ahead and download Atom. When Atom has finished downloading, I'm just going to go into my downloads folder, and I'll just go ahead and double click on this atommac.zip file. And if you're on Windows, you might have to go through an installer process. If you're on Mac though, now you basically have Atom over here. So you just move it into your applications folder and you'll be able to start using it. So I already have Atom installed on my computer, so I'm going to go ahead and open it up. And once we have Atom open, there's a bunch of different stuff that we can do. One thing you might want to do when you first get into Atom is go down here into Preferences or Settings, and over here you can configure a bunch of stuff. So you'll see over here on the side we have an option for like Editor. You can also configure like a theme, so you can change like what the text editor is going to look like. You can do a bunch of stuff over here just to kind of configure Atom to your liking. In order to be running Ruby programs on here, we're actually going to have to install one thing, which is a package. So over here on the settings page, I'm just going to go over here to this install button, and inside of here we want to search for a program. It's just going to be called Atom-Runner. And essentially what this plugin is going to allow us to do is it's going to allow us to run our Ruby scripts or our Ruby programs from inside Atom. It's going to make it really easy for us to do this. So you'll see right here it's just Atom-Runner, and I've actually already installed it, but over here there should be an install button just like you see down here. So click the install button on Atom-Runner, and once that's installed, then we have everything we need to start programming Ruby from inside here. So Now that we have Atom Runner installed, I'm going to show you guys how to set up your first Ruby file. So the first thing I'm going to do is come over here to File, and I'm actually going to add a project folder. So I'm just going to click Add Project Folder, and I'm just going to add my Documents folder because this is the folder that I'm going to be working with throughout the course. And I'll just click Open. As you'll see over here, now we have this little like File Explorer window. So that can actually be pretty useful just so we can see like what the different files are that we're working with. So inside this Documents folder, I'm actually just going to right click and I'm going to say New File. And I'm going to go ahead and create a new file, and I'm just going to call this file draft.rb. So whenever we're creating a Ruby file, we want to use this .rb extension, and that's basically going to tell our computer that this is going to be a Ruby program. And you can name it whatever you want. I'm just naming it draft. So I'm going to click enter, and now we have our first Ruby file up and running. So what I want to do now is just write a simple line of Ruby code inside of here. We'll test it out, we'll make sure everything's working, and that way we know we have our environment set up to go for the rest of the course. So over here, I'm just going to type print, and I'm going to type in open and closed quotation marks, and I'm just going to type hello world. And I'm just going to go ahead and save that. So just print this out, and basically what this does is it just prints a line of text out onto the screen. So now what we want to do is use that Atom Runner plugin. So remember, we installed that Atom Runner plugin before, and now I can actually use that to execute this Ruby code. So I'm just going to click Control and R. So Control R, and you'll see this is going to go ahead and run our program. So down here at the bottom of the screen, I actually have this little output window. And you'll see down here that it's printed out hello world. So it's gone ahead and printed out hello world onto the screen. So as long as that's working, as long as the Control R was able to run that Atom Runner package and we were able to execute the Ruby code, then everything's set up. We're ready to start going in this course. We're ready to start writing some awesome Ruby code. In this tutorial, I'm going to talk to you guys about the basics of Ruby programs. So we're going to write a very simple Ruby program. We're going to talk about how those programs get executed, the order in which the instructions in those programs get executed. We're also going to talk about different ways that we can print things out onto the screen. So it's going to be a pretty awesome tutorial. I'm really excited. First thing I want to show you guys is how to print something out onto the screen. So you'll notice over here I have my little Atom Runner output window. And in the last tutorial we talked about setting up this basic environment. So what I want to do is show you guys how to print something out onto this little console window over here. So all we have to do to print something out is just type print, a space, and then if you want to print out like plain text, we can just make an open and close quotation marks, and we can put any text we want. So I could put like Draft Academy here. And now when I run this program by clicking Control R, you'll see that Draft Academy gets printed out onto the screen over here. There's also another way that we can print something out onto the screen. So in addition to just saying print, I could also say puts. And puts basically works the same way as prints. It's going to take whatever we put inside of these quotation marks and it's going to print it out onto the screen. So for example, I could type my name like Mike, and now this is going to get printed out onto the screen over here. Now you'll notice that Draft Academy and Mike are getting printed out right next to each other. And this actually brings me to the first thing I want to talk about, which is the difference between print and puts. So you'll notice here I'm using this print command. I'm printing out Draft Academy, and then right below it I'm printing out Mike using this puts command. And when I use this print command, Mike just gets printed out right next to Draft Academy, as you can see over here. But if I was to take this puts command and move it up here right above Draft Academy, so now the program's going to execute puts Mike before it executes Draft Academy, what you'll notice is that Draft Academy gets printed out on a new line. That's because whenever you use this puts command, it's going to print out whatever you put over here, and it's also going to print out a new line afterwards, which basically means that when you use puts, you can print things out on different lines. When you use print, however, everything gets printed out on the same line. So if I wanted to print out two things right next to each other, for example, I could print out something over here like is cool. Now, these are going to get printed out right next to each other. So you can see it says Draft Academy is cool. But if I was to do the same thing with puts, for example, if I did another puts down here and I said is cool, because I'm using this puts up here, this is actually going to get printed out onto a new line. So you'll see down here, that's exactly what happens. So that's the two different ways that we can print something out onto the screen, using prints and using puts. Again, puts will print out whatever you specify, and then it'll print out a new line. Print will just print out whatever you specify, no new line. So that's the basic difference between those two. So now what I want to do is just show you how we can use these print statements to draw a little shape out onto the screen. So over here, I'm just going to say puts, and I'm going to make an open and close quotation mark, and I'm actually going to copy this a couple times. So we'll paste this like a few times down below here. And I want to show you guys how we can just draw a basic like triangle shape. So I'm going to start with a forward slash down here, and I'll make another forward slash, another one up here, and another one there. And now I'm just going to make vertical bars going all the way down. And I'm going to make some underscores down here. And now we have a basic little triangle right here. So you can see I'm using this puts statement, and individually on each one of these lines, I'm printing out some text. So now if I was to go over here and run my program, you'll notice that we're printing out this triangle, and it looks pretty good. So this is sort of the basics of drawing something out onto the screen. I also want to talk to you guys about how these programs get executed. So when we run our Ruby program or our Ruby script, basically what happens is Ruby is going to go through and it's going to look at each line individually inside of this script. It's going to start with the first line here. So it's going to say, okay, the first instruction that the user wants me to do is print this line of text out onto the screen. So Ruby's going to look at this first instruction, it's going to execute it, and then once it's done with this instruction, it's going to move on to the next instruction. So it's moving on to the next line, and it's going to go ahead and execute this instruction. And then when it's done with this one, it's going to move on to the next line and the next line, etc. So Ruby is looking through each instruction that we give it inside of our program. And an instruction in Ruby is just something like this. It's like this puts or that print that we saw before. And there's tons of these different instructions that we can give Ruby. But the point is that Ruby's going to execute them in the order that we write them. So Ruby's going to start with this line, move on to this line, etc. So if I was to take this bottom line here and move it up here to the top, now it's going to execute this line of code first. So you'll see over here, we get this like funky looking shape. So that's sort of like the bare basics of how Ruby is working. We're giving it sets of instructions, right? I'm just writing out a bunch of different instructions, and Ruby's going to execute them in order, and it's going to do essentially whatever we tell it to do. So right now, all we're doing is telling Ruby to print something out onto the screen. But as we learn more about Ruby and as we go forward and we learn more instructions that we can give it, we can actually make programs to do just about anything. So as long as you can specify specific enough instructions for the computer, you can do anything inside of a programming language. And that's kind of like the core concept that I wanted to give you guys today, which is how these programs are structured and how to write essentially a basic program that prints a shape out onto the screen. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about using variables in Ruby. Now, in Ruby, you're going to be dealing with a lot of different data. And generally, anytime you write a program, there's going to be all sorts of data that you want to maintain and manage. And a lot of times, when you're dealing with large amounts of data, it can be difficult to manage it. It can be difficult to keep track of it. So in Ruby, we have a special container where we can store data values called a variable. And a variable is pretty awesome because we can actually take a piece of data or a piece of information in our Ruby programs, we can store it inside of a variable, and then whenever we want to use that piece of data or access it or modify it, we can just refer to its variable container. And you'll see in this tutorial why variables can be really useful. So let's go ahead and jump in. Down here I have a basic Ruby program written out. Essentially all it does is it prints out a story. It says, there once was a man named George. He was 70 years old. He really liked the name George, but didn't like being 70. And you'll see I'm just using this puts instruction over here, and here it's just printing out the story onto the screen. So we're essentially just printing out everything that's over here onto the screen over here. So this is a pretty awesome program, right? It works, it's completely valid. But let's say that I wanted to go inside of my little story here and start modifying some of the information, right? Let's say that I wanted to change the character's name. So maybe I don't like the name George and I want to change his name to John. So I'm gonna have to go through, and I found that first place where the character's name was, and I have to keep searching through, and then, okay, here's another place where we have the character's name. So I'm gonna change it. So now I've officially changed the character's name in the story. But let's say that I'm reading over the story again, and I'm thinking to myself, I think we can make the character a little bit younger. So instead of 70, why don't we make him 35, right? So again, I'm gonna have to look through this entire program. All right, found the first 70, so I'll change this to a 35. I have to keep looking through, and okay, here's the other 70, so we'll change this to 35. All right, so now I've updated the name and the age. But here's the problem. When I wanted to change the character's name and the character's age, I had to manually go into my program, into this story, and modify each value. So every place where the character's name was mentioned, I had to update it to the new name. Every place where the character's age was mentioned, I had to go in and update it. And this is kind of a problem, right? This is a situation where we have two pieces of data, the character's name and the character's age, and we're trying to keep track of that information, right? But imagine that instead of just having a story that was 4 lines, I had a story that was hundreds of lines long, right? And they mentioned the character's name, hundreds of times. If I wanted to then go through and change my character's name in my story, it would be a real drag, right? I would have to look through hundreds of lines of code in order to do that. Same goes for the age. And this is actually where variables come in. So this is a perfect example of a time where we have 2 pieces of information, the name and the age, and we want to be able to keep track of them and maintain them a lot better than we currently are. So what I can actually do is I can create a container, and I could put the character's name inside of its own container. I could put the character's age inside of its own container. And then when I want to access that information and use it, I can just access that container. And that container is called a variable. So I'm going to show you guys how we can use variables to seriously increase the usability of this program. So up here, up above these puts lines, I'm actually going to create a variable. And whenever we create a variable, we need to give Ruby some information. The first piece of information we need to give Ruby is the name of the variable that we want to create. So generally, when we create a container to put information in inside of our programs, we like to give it a descriptive name, right? Generally, you want to give the container a name that will identify what information is inside of it. So the first thing I'm going to go do over here is type in the name of the variable that I want to create. So I'm going to create one called character name. And generally in Ruby, if you're creating a variable, you want to give it a descriptive name. And if there's going to be multiple words like character name, you want to separate them with an underscore. So the next thing I have to do is tell Ruby what I want to store inside of this variable. So I can just say character name, and I can use this equal sign, and I can set it equal to a value. So I can say character name equals, and I'm just going to say John, because this is going to be the new character's name. So now I've officially created a variable called character name. The next thing we can do is create another variable to store the character's age. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to say character age, and I'm going to set this equal to 35. So now we have 2 variables, both of which are storing values. So down here in my program, what I can actually do, instead of just typing out the character's name like this, manually, I can actually just refer to the variable that is storing the character's name. So over here, instead of saying there once was a man named John, I can actually just get rid of this. And outside of these quotation marks, I'm actually going to make a plus sign. And now I'm going to type out the name of the variable that I want to put in here. So I'm just going to say character underscore name. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm saying I want to type out all of this text over here, plus I want to type out the value that's inside of the character's name. So I want to print out the value that's inside this character name variable. There's one more thing we have to do. Anytime you're using a string of text like this, and you're also using a variable name, you need to surround this whole thing with parentheses. So I'm going to put a parentheses over there, and I'm going to put a parentheses over here. And so now we'll actually be able to use this program. So let's go ahead and we're going to run this program. And now you'll see that over here it still says there once was a man named John. He was 35 years old, etc. But you'll notice that we didn't have to manually type out the word John. All we had to do was refer to the actual variable name, character name. So I just referred to this variable, and it was able to insert the value that was stored inside that variable inside of our print statement. So I could basically do this same thing for this guy down here. So I'm just gonna copy this, and I'm gonna paste this in down here. So now I'm adding in the character name where John was in that other spot. So over here, we're also gonna have to put another parentheses. And I'm gonna do the same thing for the character's age. So over here, once again, we'll just surround this with parentheses. And now I'm just gonna close off both of these. So I have two separate little strings of text inside of quotation marks. And I'm gonna put a plus sign. I'm gonna type in the variable name, character age, and then I'm gonna put another plus sign. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm telling Ruby that I wanna print this out, plus I wanna print out the value inside of the character age variable, plus I wanna print this out over here. So that's essentially what this is doing. And we can do the same thing down here. So, and again, we're gonna need to surround this with parentheses. So once we've done this, now we've actually set up our program to use all of these variables. So every place where we mentioned the character's age, we replaced it with the character age variable. Every place where we mentioned the character's name, we replaced it with the character name variable. So when I run this program now, you'll see over here we get exactly the same output as we did before. We're printing out the same exact story. The only difference is now that we're using variables, our program is a lot better. So for example, if I wanted to change the character's name inside of my story, instead of having to go through and manually change it in every single spot where we mentioned it, I can actually come up here and just modify it. So I could change the character's name to Mike. And now, without having to modify anything else in my entire program, the character's name is going to be updated to Mike. So you can see now it's using the name Mike. And that's really why variables are powerful, because they allow us to organize and they allow us to keep track of the information and the data inside of our programs a lot better. The other thing you can do is you can actually modify the value of variables. So let's say halfway through my story, I wanted the character's name to change. I can actually come down here, and I'm just gonna put this line of code right after these first two and right before these second two. I could change the value of a variable. So I could say character name, and I can just set it equal to something else. So I could set it equal to Tom, for example. So now, when I go and run my program, you'll see that halfway through the story, the character's name changes. So over here it's Mike, and then halfway through it changes to Tom. So you can update and modify the values of these variables throughout your program, and that can be extremely useful. So that's sort of the basics of variables, and these can be really useful. There's a lot more that we can talk about. So for example, over here, I'm just storing text information, right? I'm storing like the text Mike, I'm storing the text 35. Down here, we're using all this text. But in Ruby, we can actually represent and we can store a bunch of different types of data inside of our variables. And that's what I'm going to be talking about in the next tutorial. We're going to be talking about data types. So there's all different types of data types. We can store like text data, numbers, true, false values, a bunch of different stuff. So stick around for the next tutorial and we'll talk about that. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you about data types in Ruby. A data type is essentially a type of data that we can represent and use inside of our Ruby programs. And by default, Ruby is going to support a bunch of different data types. So these are basically just types of information that we can use in our programs. And I want to talk to you guys about the different types of data that we can use, and we're going to look at how we can store those different types of data inside of variables. So down here, I'm actually going to create a couple different variables, and we're going to store some different types of information inside of those variables. And the first and probably most basic type of data that we can represent in our Ruby programs is called a string. And a string is basically just plain text. So anytime we want to represent plain text in our Ruby programs, we can use a string. So I could just make a string called like name, and I could set it equal to Mike. So this is a good example of a string. It's basically a variable, and we're storing a string value inside of it. So the string is just like any plain text, right? You could also make another one, occupation, and we could set it equal to like programmer, whatever. You can store any like information that you'd want to store as plain text inside of your programs as a string. We could also store numbers. So for example, I could store a whole number. Like if I wanted to specify someone's age, I could say age is like 75, right? So someone might be 75 years old. We can represent numbers like this inside of our Ruby programs. And you'll notice that with a number, I didn't need to use these quotation marks. I just had to type out the number that I wanted to type out. You can also use decimal numbers. So this right here, 75, is what would be referred to as an integer. And an integer is basically just a counting number, like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Basically a number, like a whole number. A decimal number is different because a decimal has decimal points after it. And a lot of times, especially in Ruby, we'll refer to these numbers as floating point numbers. Basically just means that they're decimal numbers. So if I wanted to specify a floating point number, I could say like GPA, and we could set it equal to like 3.2. Or you can set it equal to 3.2854, whatever. Like you can set it equal to, whatever decimal point you want to represent inside of Ruby. So using integers and using floats, you can represent different types of numbers. You can also make these negative. So I can make this like a negative 75 or a negative 3.2, and Ruby's going to be just fine with that. In addition to storing numbers, we can also store something called a Boolean. And a Boolean is basically a true-false data type. So a lot of times in programs, we're going to want to represent true or false data. And this might not be something that you're super used to doing in the real world, but in programming, when we're specifying types of data, a lot of data is going to fall into like the true or false category. For example, if I created a variable called isMale, this variable could tell us whether or not someone is a male. In which case, it's going to be like a true or false value, right? They're either a male or they're not. It only has two possible values. So I could set this equal to true because I'm a guy. You could also create one, it could be like is tall. And this Boolean variable would tell us whether or not someone's tall, right? So if you're not tall, then it would be false. So a lot of information in our programs can be represented with one of two values, either true or false. We can also store one more type of information, which is called nil. And the nil data type basically means that it doesn't have a value. So for example, if I created a variable called like flaws and I set it equal to nil, basically what this means is this flaws variable doesn't have a value. So we can go out of our way to say that something is nil, like to say that it has no value. So these are the basic data types in Ruby. And there's actually like a couple other like more obscure data types that we could use, but for the most part, these are the data types that you're going to be using as a beginner to the Ruby programming language. So we can store and represent information in either text form with a string, number form with an integer, which is a whole number, or a floating point number, which is like a decimal number. Or we can use true or false values, and we can also use nil, which would mean no value. So these are sort of the basics. And as we go forward in this Ruby course, we're going to be looking at all sorts of ways that we can work with this type of data. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about working with strings in Ruby. Now, strings are one of the most common data types in Ruby, and for good reason. A lot of times in our programs, we're going to want to represent and store and work with plain text data. That's essentially what a string is. So in this tutorial, I want to walk you guys through the basics of using strings. We're going to look at some different things we can do with strings. We're going to also look at different things called methods, which we can use on strings. So a method is essentially just a little block of code that we can call, and it will either modify our string or give us information about our string. So it can be pretty awesome. First thing I want to do is just show you guys basically how to print out a string. So I could say puts, and over here, to create my string, I just have to put it inside of open and closed quotation marks. So anything I put inside these quotation marks is going to be considered a string. So I could just type out like Giraffe Academy, and now this is going to get printed out over here onto the screen. Works pretty well. There's a couple things we can do inside of these strings. So one thing you might be wondering is, how can I print out a quotation mark? So for example, this string is surrounded by quotation marks. We use the quotation marks to tell Ruby where the string starts and ends. But what if I wanted to use quotation marks inside of this string? If I just try to put one right here, you'll see that it messes everything up and it ends the string. In order to use a quotation mark, I can put a backslash, and then put the quotation mark. And this is basically going to tell Ruby, hey, I want to literally enter in the character quotation mark. I don't want to use it to end off my string. So now I should be able to print this out over here. You'll see we're printing out a quotation mark. You can also use something similar to print out a new line. So let's say that I wanted to print out draft, and then on a new line print out academy. I could type a \n, and I'm actually going to get rid of this space. And now you'll see that this is going to print out draft academy on 2 separate lines. So that can be pretty useful. Another thing we can do is we can store strings inside of variables. So if I didn't want to just type this out like this, I could put it inside of a variable, inside of a container, and it'll be a little bit easier for me to work with. So why don't we create a variable called phrase, and I'm just going to set it equal to draft academy. Now if we wanted to print this out, all I have to do is come down here and just type in the name of the variable that I want to print out. So now we'll just be printing out phrase. And you'll see we're still printing out draft academy. So using these variables can be pretty useful. And when we're working with strings, we can actually use things called string methods, or sometimes you'll hear people refer to them as string functions. Essentially what these are little blocks of code, and we can call these blocks of code, and they'll go off and they'll either modify our string, so they'll change it in some way, shape, or form, or they'll give us information about our strings. These can be really useful. And there's just a few that I want to show you, and you'll kind of get the hang of how to use these. Whenever we're going to use one of these methods, we just want to type out either the name of the variable that's storing the string, or just the string itself. And then I want to type out dot, and now I want to type in the name of the method or function that we want to access. So I'm going to show you guys a couple that are pretty useful. I found them to be pretty useful. The first is called upcase. So you're just going to type out upcase, and then an open and closed parentheses. And actually, this open and closed parentheses in a lot of situations is going to be optional, but I'm just going to include it just to be super correct. So when I type phrase.upcase and we run this program, you'll see now it takes our string, it takes our phrase, and converts it entirely into uppercase letters. You can also use another one called downcase. So instead of saying upcase, we'll just say downcase, and this is going to convert it down to all lowercase letters. So this can be a pretty useful little function. There's also another one called strip. So if I had a string that had a bunch of leading and trailing spaces, right, I wouldn't necessarily want to just print this out. So if I print this out onto my screen, you'll see that we get it printed out all weird, right? There's these, spaces in front, there's these spaces after. You can use a method called strip. So I'm just going to type out phrase.strip. And now when I run my program, all of that leading and trailing white space gets deleted. So a lot of cases when you're dealing with a variable, you might not know if it has leading and trailing white space. So you can use this strip method to make sure that all of that disappears. We can also use these methods to find out information about our strings. For example, instead of saying strip, I could say phrase.length, and this is going to tell me how many characters are inside of this string. So you can see over here we get 24, and actually let me get rid of all this white space. So now we should get a smaller number, 15. So Draft Academy has 15 characters in it. That's including any of the spaces that we put inside of it. In addition to figuring out how many characters are in a string, I can also figure out if certain text shows up in my strings. So for example, I could say phrase.include. So I'm going to say include, and now I'm going to type a question mark. And then I'm going to type a space, and now I'm going to type a string. I'm going to type another string. Basically what we're saying is we're asking this include method whether or not this phrase includes the string that we're going to put over here. So for example, if I put academy right here, this is going to return a true or a false value, telling us whether or not the word academy shows up inside of our phrase. So over here, we should get a true value because academy does show up. If I was to type out like academies though, so for example, this isn't inside of our phrase, it's going to give me a false value. So that's a really good way to figure out if a certain string or a certain phrase or a certain character shows up in the string that you're working with. We could also access individual characters inside of these strings. So for example, let's say that I wanted to just figure out what the first character in this string was. So maybe I was just given this variable phrase and I don't know what's inside of it, and I wanted to figure out what the first character is. I can type out the string, and then I can make an open and closed square bracket, and inside of these square brackets I can put the index of the character that I want to access. So if I wanted to access this G, I can actually put a 0 inside of here. So now you'll see this is just going to print out that G. If I wanted to access this I could put a 1 in here. And this is going to print out the I. If I wanted to access this A, for example, it's going to be 0, 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to put a 3 in here, and now we'll be able to access that A. So if you haven't caught on already, the way that we assign index positions to strings in Ruby is starting with 0. So if I was going to give these characters index positions, I would say that G is at index position 0, I is at index position 1, R2, A3, F4, other F5, E6, etc. So whenever we want to access the first character in a string, we have to access it using index position 0. And this is kind of like a staple of using strings in Ruby. The first character is always at index position 0. So essentially Ruby starts counting at 0. So anytime we want to use this little method right here,